Good day to you. Have you heard the news? Yeah, the news. As if there's just one news out there and everybody knows about it except for you. But that saying sure does get your interest, does it not? Do your ears perk up when you hear that saying or when you say that saying? Sounds like it could be gossip, right? Underlying that term, though, is the term new, and we forget that that is the root form of the word news. It has to be something new. And there is a whole gigantic profitable industry in the mass media that delivers this kind of content, news in the mass media. So that's what we're taking on today in Chapter 5. We're taking on our next stage of legacy media. We took a look at books last time, which is the first legacy medium that we're studying in this class. Today we're really looking at newspapers and magazines together as legacy media, although I have to say those terms themselves are outdated because newspapers really are distributing their content and most interested in distributing their content on the web. So are they even a paper anymore? That's for you to maybe think about as we go down the road. This subject is very interesting when we start to consider what we expect from news and who owns the companies delivering the news. For example, Jeff Bezos, one of the richest people in the world, owns Amazon.com, and he also owns the Washington Post, which is one of the most storied newspapers in the United States, a political newspaper that actually, through some of its reporting, brought down an entire presidency, the presidency of Richard Nixon, through its exposure of the Watergate scandal, which is where Nixon's operatives were spying on the Democratic campaign headquarters to try and learn secrets of their campaign so that the Democrats could be defeated. So news has a big impact on society, and you're getting news almost every day. You're getting it from Yahoo, you're getting it from Twitter. If you're not getting it from legacy media, you're getting news every single day. So we're taking on news today. Let's get to the history of the newspaper. We're going to start with the very first English-speaking newspaper. It was not here in the New World. It was in Amsterdam. The name of the paper was Coranto, and the date was 1618, the very first English-speaking newspaper. If you're wondering why English-speaking newspapers are being developed in Amsterdam, it's because it's a very international city, and a city today that's still known for a tremendous tolerance of all kinds of things, including so-called vices, because it's a port city that people are going in and out of all the time. I've been to Amsterdam many times. So the first English-speaking newspaper starts there. And in general, newspapers sprout up around Europe because of the Gutenberg printing press, because now we have the ability to print pages, and not just in books, and just disperse those pages in the form of newspapers to all of Europe. Originally, though, newspapers needed to be licensed by European governments, and particularly the crown or the royalty that was in power in most of those European countries. And the reason for that is they didn't want newspapers criticizing the royal family, pointing out their hypocrisy in their lives, or how much wealth they had, or how mean they were to serfs, poor people, SERFs, if you know that word. People working the land, I should say. And so we have a question right away of when do newspapers and other media that follow that do news, when do they have freedom from interference from owners or from the people who they are licensed to? Over here in the U.S., the very first appearance of a newspaper was Public Occurrences, again with that strange spelling, Publick. And that newspaper was published in the U.S. in 1690. I want to just point out that's before we were a country, right? We're still the colonies there. And during that time period, the government was shutting down papers here in the colonies that were making disparaging remarks against the King of France, because the King of France and France as a nation was an ally against Britain, who we were waging a revolutionary war against. Now, here's a name that you'll sort of be familiar with, James Franklin. James Franklin, he published the New England Courant in 1721. And to illustrate that point about kings, he was actually thrown in jail for irritating the authorities. He was criticizing all the time the British authorities, and he was thrown in jail, and so his brother took over the paper, and you know his brother is Ben Franklin, right? He took over the newspaper as the editor, publisher, and owner at the age of 16, Ben Franklin did. That's where he started to get his career path started as a media mogul. And later, Ben Franklin used that knowledge to purchase the Pennsylvania Gazette, and he turned it into the most influential newspaper in all of New England, the Pennsylvania Gazette. Now let's turn our attention to what is known as the penny press, similar to the dime novel that we talked about last time with books. The penny press was the cost of a newspaper after the cost came down because of industrialization. And so now people could afford the newspaper. But in the beginning, newspapers, before they were affordable by only paying a penny, when they were still going through the process of that mass production and the costs had not come down yet, these were the content that was produced by newspapers in New England was for the elite and wealthy, people who did not, people who were educated and who had money, essentially. And a lot of the stories in newspapers were shipping news, very esoteric shipping news. In addition, most of the newspapers in the colonies were political party affiliated. They were not objective. They were put out by the Democrat Party, or the Whig Party as it was known then, or other parties that were gaining steam. They would sponsor a newspaper. So objectivity was not a value at all. But that all changes with the penny press, and we're going to highlight some of the famous newspaper publishers now who got into the game and made this industry really competitive. And the first one we're going to talk about is Benjamin Day. Benjamin Day, he started a newspaper called the New York Sun. The New York Sun, it's a tabloid-looking newspaper. You can still see that style of newspaper in New York today. It was a new kind of newspaper that would sell to large numbers of people rather than going just for educated elite audiences. And he was the first one to come up with a saying for his newspaper called, "It shines for you." I almost said on. It shines for you. So the paper promoting a slogan saying that the paper is acting on the behalf of the public to spread the light on affairs that would otherwise not be seen. And we can actually see the word sun appear in many newspaper titles across the world. You'll see that word sun for that same kind of metaphorical influence. And what was going on here was the steam engine was replacing the hand mechanisms that you needed for printing presses. So you no longer need a human being, which could still put out papers and books quickly, but now you have a steam engine, and the steam rises and pushes a paddle wheel, and that's what produces the paper. So that really sped up how fast newspapers could be produced. And now that newspapers are being read by all kinds of people, the newspapers themselves started to pull back from providing political content, because instead what they could use is advertisements. And so many people are reading the newspaper, they can sell space in the newspaper, and that's how they can make the money rather than relying on political parties. So newspapers started to emphasize during this era in 1833, that's when we're talking about with Benjamin Day and the New York Sun, they started to emphasize facts over opinion. And the paper started to disassociate themselves from being aligned with political parties. Other newspapers followed this model, including the Critic, the Herald, and the Star, all selling for a penny. The big selling papers could attract tons of advertisers, such as narcotic makers, such as furniture makers. And this is when actually we get the term news. News for the first time is being conceptualized as a product that can be delivered by media. It's new. And the kinds of information we get to illustrate its objective, or at least not politically oriented, we have information about the police, about courts, and what's happening on the street. That's what people wanted to know, especially as America's starting to experience a big influx of immigrants. And we can still see that today, right? News today still very much emphasizes court cases. Look at Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, for example. It's still seen as a bellwether piece of content to report. All right, next on, we're going to talk about how the public started to use consumer goods because the public was experiencing wealth from working in factories. You're not just working on the farm anymore and putting in labor. Now you're in an industrialized America. You have your own apartment building. It may not be very nice. Your working conditions are probably going to be terrible. More about that later. But you do have money. And so you have some money now, and so people are starting to spend it on books and newspapers for news and entertainment. And news is developed as the product that is delivered to satisfy this taste. We can also say that the penny press, just like the book, also helped a democratic society. It started to inform people so that they didn't have to rely on elected leaders who were perceived themselves to be more knowledgeable and better than themselves. Now elected representatives could be representatives of hopefully an informed public. Now let's go to two people we're going to highlight simultaneously here, at least right next to each other. These are two people who are locked into a fierce competition in New York City. And the first person is Joseph Pulitzer. Have you heard that name, Joseph Pulitzer? He was an Austrian native, and he came to the U.S. to fight in the Civil War. And what he ended up doing was being a reporter for a German newspaper reporting on the Civil War. Isn't that interesting? Our war is a news product to Europe, and we have that right now with Ukraine and Russia. So after his experience as a reporter, he then bought the St. Louis Post and Dispatch. That was a newspaper. 1878 is the year. He became the publisher, and he grew that circulation in the Dispatch from 15,000 people to, get this, 250,000 people. Now, that's nothing today in terms of TikTok followers, but at that time, 15,000 to 250,000. And then what he did was he decided to set his sights on the biggest media market in the world, New York City. And he decided to do that by purchasing a newspaper there and turning it into a newspaper he called the New York World. And he turned that newspaper around. He did a lot of things to it to make it, well, sensational. He changed the appearance, mostly. He made the newspapers much more dramatic that came out from the New York Sun. He made it much more dramatic with big headlines and lots of photos as opposed to blank text. And you can see the examples of that in today's links that are in the email. He also invented a concept called the above the fold concept. You know, when you take a newspaper out and you open it up, it opens vertically, right? There's that form again looking like a tablet and a cell phone. It opens vertically, but there's a fold line. So the above the fold story was a kind of a complement to the lead story of the day. It's a more prestigious story, and we still see that at play as well. Also, Joseph Pulitzer was the first one who started to use easy words in a newspaper. Have you heard the expression newspapers write at a 5th grade reading level? That's because there were so many immigrants in New York City, Italians and others, who didn't have the English language. So they were looking to newspapers to learn English. And in order for that to be helpful to them, they could not have really big words in an English newspaper. So right off the bat, news gets off to a start in this country anyhow, at least in the newspaper industry, is not being something that's trying to lift people up and enlighten them so much as it is meant to be understood. Also, Pulitzer hired a female stunt journalist, Nellie Bly. Have you heard her name? She was a stunt journalist because she would use deceptive practices to get inside of places and expose corruption and expose racial injustice, basically. Her most famous endeavor was to get herself committed to a mental asylum. And while she was in there, she wrote about the deplorable conditions inside there in terms of health and how the patients were treated, and she did get herself out. She actually worked for many newspapers. She covered a lot of women in factories as part of her mission in life. Again, one of the very first racial justice warriors, if you want to think of that. Now let's go over to the other person who's competing with Joseph Pulitzer, and I'm going to come back to Pulitzer because you know that name, right? Pulitzer, the Pulitzer Prize. We'll come back to that. So the next person is William Randolph Hearst. He's got 3 names, Hearst. He was from San Francisco, had a very different background. He had a privileged background. He was born into a newspaper family, and he decided also, though, that he wanted to go to New York and try and strike it rich in this competitive media market. So he goes to New York, and he starts a newspaper that's kind of like Benjamin Day's, and he calls it the New York Journal. And then both of those newspapers began a war against each other to try and steal readers. Sound familiar? That's what happens today in television between channels. It's what happens today in search engines. It's what happens today in any media product competition. It was very fierce. And this time period was marked by a kind of journalism that was called yellow journalism. The common understanding of that is that it's journalism that's a day old or that it's sensational, but that's not where the term comes from. It comes from a cartoon that used to run in these newspapers called The Yellow Kid, and that's where yellow journalism comes from. So, for example, what did William Randolph Hearst do to drum up competition and to dramatize the news? At the time, the U.S. was in the U.S.-Spanish War, and a lot of the battlefield theater was down around Cuba, so the U.S. had a fleet off of Cuba, and William Randolph Hearst called up one of his reporters. There was a telephone service then, and he said, "What's going on?" And the reporter said, "Nothing. There's nothing happening out here." So William Randolph Hearst says to him, "Okay, you furnish the photos, and we'll furnish the war." Now, how about that? It's like saying we're going to create sensational whether there is any or not. So this war itself between 2 newspapers, not just the Spanish-American War, but the war between these 2 newspapers really left a bad taste in William Pulitzer's mouth. He felt that news had become, had gone in the wrong direction with sensationalism. And that's one of the reasons that he founded a school of journalism at Columbia University in New York City. So that's one of the most prestigious master's degrees programs in the United States, the Columbia School of Journalism. And then also now that's where we get the Pulitzer Prize from. That's the profession of journalism recognizing that Joseph Pulitzer had seen his bad ways and had some moral values that were important to continue on. So today, tabloids, they follow that same kind of journalism. Now let's talk about magazines for a bit. Magazines were a really big part of the early American landscape. Most people were reading magazines. They were periodicals, right? They're coming out twice a month or once a week or once a month. They're fairly regular, but not like a newspaper every single day. The magazine's main feature is it could present photojournalism. And that is the telling of news using photos. And it was made possible by an invention called the halftone. If you've ever seen impressionistic art in a museum, you stand up right next to it, it's all blurry, it just looks like a bunch of splotches. But if you stand back, suddenly the person's face comes into focus. And that's what halftones are like. Again, you can look at the link in the email today. And that now allowed magazines to start to develop a niche where they could use photographs much better than newspapers. You can't produce high quality newspapers as you can in magazines. One of the famous people to push this forward was Matthew Brady. Matthew Brady was a photographer doing mostly portraits, including presidential portraits, but he then began to shoot the Civil War. And his shots were not pretty. Some of the abhorrent sights I still have in my mind, like seeing the bodies of black men and white men laying next to each other, seeing the bodies of Northerners and Southerners laying next to each other, even seeing the bodies of two brothers, one on each side, one in the north, one in the south, laying next to each other dead in a field with their uniforms still on. That was Matthew Brady. He did a lot of that, and it actually changed the public opinion about the Civil War. They wanted it to be ended. So there's perhaps the most intense example of how news can affect public opinion in a significant way. During this time period, magazines also started to publish what were called muckraker stories. Muckrakers were investigative reporters. They were out to catch wrongdoing, mostly on the part of big corporations. The most famous publisher of muckraking stories was Samuel McClure and his magazine McClure's. And his particular targets for muckraking were insurance companies. He felt they were ripping off people. Railroads, they were covering up accidents and how they were treating their employees. And oil companies, and in particular the Standard Oil Company, was often lampooned by muckrake journalism. Standard Oil started here in Pennsylvania, by the way. It's now the Chevron Company, same company, and that was the Rockefeller family that founded that. Perhaps the most famous media magazine empire was started by Henry Luce. Henry Luce, he was an American, but his parents were missionaries, so he was actually born and raised for his early childhood in China. And then he came back to the United States, and he decided to found what has become probably the most well-known magazine in the U.S. He decided to found the Time magazine empire. Time magazine, it's a news-oriented publication, and it does have that Time Person of the Year, which is featured. It's very important to other media to take a look at that. His formula for Time, by the way, was to report multiple sides of a story, but to favor one side. So if you read a story in this news magazine today about inflation, you're going to hear many different theories about how to fix it and how it went wrong, but one of them is clearly going to come through as the theory of choice in this. So that's a different formula. Later on, Henry Luce, I said he had an empire, right? Later on, he founded Life magazine. He founded Fortune magazine. He founded Sports Illustrated magazine. If you're reading Sports Illustrated today, you can thank Henry Luce for that. Now let's go on to broadcast news. We take a little bit of a departure here. We're really focusing on newspapers and magazines, but it's important to mention broadcast news because everything is happening at once now in the development of media. I mean, we went 35,000 years from oral language to the development of written language, right? 35,000 years it took for that. And now all of a sudden, as media are being developed, starting with the Gutenberg printing press, we're starting to see an acceleration of inventions. And that's going to continue right on through the rest of the class. So we got to talk about broadcasting, which started in 1920. 1920, radio stations were founded. And again, Pennsylvania is on the map here. The very first radio station in the United States was cited as being in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was KDKA. It's got a K in front of it, that particular. I'll explain why that is when we get to covering radio in particular. It's in Pittsburgh. I've been to that station. It was part of my doctoral dissertation data points. I had to go there and collect data by observing a reporter. But what happened was when radio stations started to deliver news, the newspapers were not happy about that. For a start, many radio stations were actually owned by newspapers, and they didn't want radio cannibalizing their audiences, taking them away. So the newspapers that own radio stations tried to get together and say, okay, we're going to pass this agreement at the Biltmore Hotel in New York City, and we're going to prohibit radio stations from reporting any news before we do, then they can, because we don't want them to stop buying newspapers because they get it from radio. And radio can't report on any foreign stories, and that's it. So radio's reaction was, can I say this? Fuck that. Radio said, no, we're going to form our own news teams. And if we have to sell ourselves and become our own companies, we're going to do that. So that ban did not really hold, and radio got into the newspaper game. And then we have television comes on the scene in the 1950s, and its very first broadcast on television on NBC was the 1940 Republican Convention. So right away, the very first broadcast is not entertainment. Well, it could be entertaining to some, but mostly a news. It was mostly news content. Actually, the longest running show on television is Meet the Press. I watch it on Sunday mornings. Meet the Press started in 1947. TV originally started with 15-minute newscasts, and then they expanded it to 30 minutes. I mean, you can say it's 30 minutes. It's not really, because you got advertisements in there up to 8 minutes. So sometimes news looks supposed to be half an hour, but it's only 22 minutes. That's really what it comes in. And then in the 60s, we get color coming to news as well. So all this is happening at once. Newspapers, magazines, television. What a time to live in the United States. And all of this has created the news business. So let's talk about that. When we talk about newspapers, it's not a pretty story. Circulation has been declining. Most of the competitive markets are no longer in existence. There used to be 2 major newspapers in every city. There used to be a rural small town newspaper that comes to every person's doorstep. We still have the Pocono Record in the Pocono Mountains. We have that newspaper. I used to be a columnist for that newspaper for 3 years. But by and large, circulation has dive-bombed, and newspapers have been really slow to adapt to how they can monetize their web content, because most people have grown up thinking they're going to get news for free. I'm going to get it from Yahoo. I'm not going to pay for it. So they still have a big problem of how they're going to facilitate success unless you're a really big prestigious newspaper like the New York Times or the Washington Post. In other words, monetizing content on a newspaper site is very difficult. Let's highlight now some of the major newspapers that are successful and do have a very big role in societal decision-making. Prestigious newspapers. We've got the Wall Street Journal to start off with. That is owned by the News Corporation and Rupert Murdoch. And it's a paper that's known for business and financial news. And it's a newspaper that is also known as being more conservative than it is liberal, although it will have op-eds, which are opinion editorials, that are from so-called liberal people to try and balance it out, but mostly it's a conservative newspaper. Then we've got USA Today. USA Today originally was designed to look like a television, take audiences over and get them away from television over to the newspaper. In fact, when they used to sell USA Todays, they used to put them into a vending machine that looked like a television, at least televisions at that time, outside of diners and whatnot. This newspaper was not taken seriously when it came out. It used a lot of color and cartoons and graphs, trying to look like TV. And people took that as, oh, no, that's not real news. But actually, USA Today had more of an impact on other newspapers changing than they had on it. And they started to adopt color and graphics as well. Next up is the New York Times. This is known as the most prestigious newspaper in the United States. Their slogan is all the news that's fit to print. What an interesting saying, right? It's saying if it's not in the New York Times, it's not fit to be called news, right? And actually, the New York Times has a huge gatekeeper influence on the rest of the news industry, because people who are political commentators or experts, they're on CNN or wherever, they look at the New York Times and then they decide, okay, this is the big story we got to talk about today. And so the New York Times has a profound impact. Next up is the Washington Post. We've already said a little bit about that. It's known for investigative journalism. It has also, though, had some scandals it's had to recover from. The Janet Cook scandal. She was a reporter who made up a story about a boy on heroin in Washington, D.C. I forget how young he was. He was like 11 years old. Problem was, it wasn't true. But wait, is it really a problem? Because actually, what she described was a real situation. There are 11-year-old heroin addicts in Washington, D.C., so you have to decide for yourself whether she played fast and loose with the truth or whether she was sacrificing details to try and get across a larger point. Next up, we have the LA Times. The LA Times is not related to the New York Times. It's owned by the Tribune Company, which is a Chicago company. And it's known for winning a lot of Pulitzer Prizes. These are the prizes named in Joseph Pulitzer, given out in many categories: investigative journalism for one, political journalism for another. It's won the most. And also the LA Times is known for mainstreaming. And that's where you include quotes from women and minorities to get them mainstreamed into society and not have them marginalized. Now that we're done with all the big newspapers, there are plenty of local and community newspapers. We've got weeklies, we've got dailies. They used to arrive in the driveway. They used to arrive in the box that people have at the end of the driveway. My very first job was a newspaper boy. We had to go collect the money from people when it was due. If people had dogs, that was, it was a scary situation. All right, now we're going to go on to different dimensions of news that are current today, starting with fake news. What is fake news? It's news that's false. That's the easy question, right? But can satire news be fake news? Can mistake news, like you tried as hard as you could to get the story right, but you made a mistake, can that be fake news? Is partisan news fake? Is fake news really foreign political manipulation like China or Russia creating bots that get people to think certain ways? It's a big mess, right? How do you consider what fake news? But the problem is it has diluted the public's confidence in what is actually news. Now let's go on to patriotism in the press. So actually, journalism can be a dangerous occupation. We've seen that in the Ukraine-Russian war. Some of the early people killed were reporters for Fox News, for example. But there are other threats as well, like when you go to report on a drug cartel in Mexico, there are sort of unwritten rules. You can speak generally about things that have happened, but if you start talking about a specific family, you might get disappeared. Or you might get a phone call that says something like, hey, I hear your daughter is supposed to get her driver's license test tomorrow. Click. Now, I don't want to do anything to create an already existing misstereotype of Mexico that it's an unsafe, dangerous, dirty place full of drug cartels. I wouldn't be sitting in Mexico if it wasn't that way, but it's a fact. It's a fact when it comes to reporting on drug cartels. All right, next issue that we want to take up. Sorry, my note scrolled here a little bit ahead of me. Got to find my place again. Next issue that we want to take up is ethnic press. Yeah, there's a long history of ethnic press in the United States that is giving voices to people who would have otherwise been marginalized by the mainstream press. So we've got minority and ethnic papers. There have been nearly 4,000 black-oriented newspapers in the U.S. since the inception of newspapers. One of the very first was the Freedom Journal. The Freedom Journal in 1827. It concentrated a lot on the mistreatment of black people. It was co-founded by John Russwurm, Russwurm. He was the first black person to get a college degree in the United States, and you probably don't know his name, right? Pretty amazing. Prior to his paper, blacks didn't exist at all if you read a newspaper. It's like, where are black people in this country? There aren't any if you're reading the newspaper, except in crime stories, right? We can see that today still, right? Yeah. The show Cops. I watched it for years. How can the show be on the air? Everybody who's arrested is black. Just about. Finally, it got taken off the air during the BLM movement. And now it's back on the air. And very specifically, you see black police officers featured in that. It had to correct itself as part of the inherent racism that was going on. The next newspaper is the North Star. 1847 for that one. That was founded in Rochester, New York. That was a serious newspaper. It was not tabloid. It was about emancipation. And this was published by perhaps the most famous African-American figure in American politics and education, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a slave. He was a slave. He was born into slavery, and then he escaped. And what did he do when he went north? He used the power of speech to change people's minds. He started advocating for racial equality for African Americans and for women as well. And that's why many universities, including ESU, have a Frederick Douglass Institute. He spells his last name with two S's, by the way, Gouglass. Another newspaper was the Chicago Defender. The Chicago Defender in 1905, it was a yellow journalism newspaper, just like Benjamin Day's, except it used red headlines. And this paper was all about encouraging black people to move from the South to the North to find jobs, to find freedom, to find economic freedom and social and political freedom. In addition to those black newspapers, black-oriented newspapers, we have plenty of Spanish-language newspapers coming on the scene more and more each year as we have more Spanish speakers in the United States. Perhaps the most well-known one is El Nuevo Herald, which is the New Herald. And that's a companion to the Miami Herald. It makes sense. It's published in Miami, Florida, where you have big Spanish-speaking populations, but that newspaper is read all over by Spanish-speaking people, maybe some people in this class. And then finally, you have the gay press. The gay press was started by the Washington Blade, the very first gay newspaper, biggest daily weekly, and it was started in 1969 before gay people had an outlet, or anybody from the LGBT community had an outlet in the media. The gay press was started by the Washington Blade, and then it helped move gay culture, quote unquote, into the mainstream, and also it provided an opportunity for that kind of content to move online later. So as a newspaper, it doesn't have as big of an impact today. Which leaves us now with considering the future of news. It's still very volatile. What's going to happen? We're still trying to figure out what people are going to need from news in order to function, not just to be entertained. You need to know about a lot of things in life to cast votes that are going to affect your future. But most newspapers are failing. We know that. So in the future, local news is probably going to be the strength of any media upstarts. You're going to have to concentrate on news that only you can get, even if it's like the school lunch menu in 5th grade. That's something that other newspapers will not be reporting, and you can't really find on the web and other news delivery content systems. Also, we will expect people to continue to want their news online on their cell phones and to want it for free. So you got to come over that. And so really the concept of news and paper needs to be reformed, in my view, if this sector of the media landscape industry is going to go forward. So some unfinished thoughts for you today, but I ask you again as I leave you, have you heard the news?